Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome back to another installment of the Ajay Bruno Show. Today, I'm privileged to welcome Colonel Walt Cunningham to the show. Throughout his career, he's been a fighter pilot with the U.S. Marine Corps and later a physicist and NASA astronaut who flew on Apollo 7. Hello, sir. It's good to speak to you.
Hello there, AJ. How you doing?
All right, thanks. How are you?
Well, I'm getting older.
Oh. So, let's get back to the beginning. When and how was it that you first decided you wanted to be a fighter pilot and an astronaut?
Boy, I tell you, that might be a little hard to pin down, except that during the Second World War, I was in grammar school in Southern California, and they had, P-38s, P-51s, and bombers flying over. And I got to the point where in the class, I think I was in the fifth grade, and the airplane would fly over, and the teacher would see me sitting there listening to the sound, and she'd say, "What is that?" And I'd tell her what the airplane was, just like that. So I'm sure that early in my life I had this desire, not to mention the fact that they had a couple pretty good movies back in those days on airplanes. So in any event, I wanted to become a fighter pilot, but when I started in the military, I couldn't enlist in there. I didn't have 2 years of college. I had enlisted right out of high school, and I did that because I didn't want to get drafted into the Army and go to Korea, so I joined the Navy, eventually went to flight training, took my commission in the Marine Corps, and was right at Korea.
Well, so you originally joined the Navy, but later became a Marine fighter pilot. What was your time flying missions in Korea like?
Well, we were the last squadron. It was VMF 513, flying F-3D2, which was the first jet all-weather night fighter in the Marine Corps and the Navy. And so we were fortunate to be in those. But when we were out in Korea, we had the last squadron with a mission until we moved away from there. After about 7 months, moved over to Japan. But the mission was for night and all-weather defense. And occasionally the North Koreans would fly a kind of a very light, what I ever thought of was as a civilian airplane. Might be a biplane. They'd send that down over the South Korea area down there to drop some bombs over the side, but they would only do that when they were in the soup. It was all weather, and it didn't make any difference to our guys. We got launched anyway because we were on standby all the time, anytime the weather was bad or it was night. So we'd be out there, had to be airborne in 5 minutes. But none of us was ever able to get one of those little biplanes because they were going so slow, like maybe 70 knots, maybe 80 knots, and we were in a jet that had to fly through the clouds and all of that area down there. We never ever really got to see those airplanes because we were going twice as fast as they were and couldn't spot them.
Wow. That's something. So after leaving active duty, you studied to become a physicist. What inspired you to pursue a more scientific course?
Well, in life, especially in those days, to get any place, you really had to have a college degree. In high school, I was a straight A student, but I joined the Navy to keep from being drafted to go to South Korea. In the Army, I didn't want that. And so here I was over in Korea, and I tell you when I decided that definitely, I was doing okay without a college education at the time. But after I was there for about 3 or 4 months, they said the following captains, and we were all second lieutenants, of course, but the following captains are in the zone for major. And they said, because we've promoted too many people in the past, the following majors are in the zone for major. So a couple of weeks later, they did that selection on the promotion, and the captain that we had that was the lousiest in the squadron. None of us second lieutenants could get along with him. He didn't even dress right. He was just a jerk. He made major.
Wow.
And we had one major there that we all admired and respected because of his good flying ability and all of that. He made captain. So the next day I decided I was going to go to college.
Wow. That's
so anyhow, it took me a year or so after that to transfer to a reserve squadron, so I would be back full-time college student and flying nights and weekends.
Mm-hmm. So you then went to work for the RAND Corporation. What was that like, and did that prepare you for your astronaut experience a little bit later?
Well, none of that really prepared me for astronaut experience, other than just, being bright and a capable fighter pilot. And I think I was better than just a capable fighter pilot. That's my assessment of it. Mm-hmm. But when I was in the reserve and going to college, I had to go start as a freshman out at UCLA, and of course I had to have be able to afford a living, and I was married at the time and working all kinds of jobs. I was fortunate when I got to go to work for the RAND Corporation, because I was working in the science area of the RAND Corporation. I'd always been interested in science and math, and so I was a physics major, got my bachelor's and my master's degree in physics, and was then in I was working on doctorate in physics, and it was actually the project we had was fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field measured with the first triaxial search coil magnetometer that we could get up there. So it was in the science area and to some degree in the the area of space that I was interested in.
Mm-hmm. So you were part of an extremely impressive class of astronauts when you were chosen in Group 3. What was the experience like for you when you were selected and being among this elite group?
What was my experience when I became an astronaut in that group? That group was, in many ways, we were the best qualified group up to that point because initially it was really just pilots, and there were 7 selected with the Mercury group, and with the Gemini group there was 9 more, and with the Apollo group there was 14 of us, so it came to a total of 30. But there was one change in the selection process, because you had to be a test pilot for the first 2 groups. When it got to the 3rd group, they dropped the requirement to be a test pilot, but you had to be have a very, very nice record as a fighter pilot. So about half of our group, or maybe just one less than half, I can't remember for sure, had not been to test pilot schools, and that is what enabled me to make it, because I was one of those that had not been to test pilot school.
Mm-hmm. No. I find it interesting they consider you and some other civilian astronauts, even though you were in the military before, but I guess that's because you were retired at the time or not active duty?
Well, the thing about it was, it's a civilian space agency, and everybody that they had selected up until our group was military. And with our group, the first time they got those that were in the reserve were not considered full-time military, but I considered myself military, and there was 2 of us that they classified as civilians, and the other one had gone out and had given up on any of the military flying. So I still maintained my presence. I transferred to a reserve squadron up in Dallas. I flew there with another nice new airplane, but I flew that for a while. When it got to the point where I couldn't get away from Houston enough to get all the time they wanted me in, I ended up transferring in and becoming the air liaison officer with a local infantry battalion. And that helped save me because I maintained my reserve affiliation. But I felt sorry for that battalion because I didn't know a thing about the ground activities, so they let me be the air liaison officer, and I did that for a couple of years, and it took me a while, but I still consider myself military. NASA considered me civilian, and they were trying to get more civilians. So Rusty Schweikert and I were the two civilians they had at the time. So in the long run, what that ended up being, I'm considering myself military. So in my opinion, I was the second Marine to fly in space after John Glenn. I was also the second civilian to fly in space after Armstrong. So it worked out pretty good in the long run, but it was a great career, and I think I was a little bit different with my background than a lot of the others.
No, it's interesting. So there were about 5 years between being chosen and then going into space for you. Was it primarily just a huge, grueling training regime?
Well, all of us were working to get assigned to a flight crew, and you had to have the missions to do that. So when we got there, the Mercury program was over, and they were just starting. Well, they had developed a spacecraft, but they were just starting to assign the crews to fly on Gemini, and a couple of our guys actually got on Gemini. But it was, excuse me, what was the question you asked?
Oh, sure. I was asking what you did during that period, yeah.
Okay, so while the Gemini program was still flying, the Gemini program lasted for two years. And when we started out the manned space program, we were basically behind the Russians. Mm-hmm. When Alan Shepard flew that suborbital mission, that was 3 weeks after the Russians had already sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit. And just one time around and back in, and the Russians, they didn't do anything. They were just they were along for the ride, pretty much. That was it. And under some circumstances, they could do some of the stuff, but even today, they're not the same qualified capability that we have. But 10 months after Yuri Gagarin's flight, we launched John Glenn, and he was up there for 3 orbits. And but then after the Mercury program, we did the Gemini program, and by the time the Gemini program had finished, we had taken over the lead in the space program, and it's still there today in most respects, because after Gemini, we had we had 2-man crews. Secondly, we developed a rendezvous, docking, and extravehicular activity. And with all those items, the Russians were trying to stay in competition with us. And in many respects, they've stayed in competition, but they've never really caught up with our operational capability since that time. And those of us in the third group, we worked during the second year of the Gemini programs. We were there working on systems and helping, supporting the crews. But when it got to the Apollo program, then our guys were really kind of key in some of that assignments. So the first manned Apollo mission was Apollo 7. But people today don't realize how hard it was to get to that, because when you started off, you had Apollo 1 and Apollo 2. Apollo 1 was Gus Grissom, Matt White, and Roger Chaffee. Apollo 2 was Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and myself. And it was early enough in the program, we were living at the contractors, North American, out there in California, because we didn't have a simulator. We were trying to get the time in the spacecraft, and we were helping them with, in some respects, small respects on the design, but in the engineering and the reviews and fixing it with all of that. Well, that slowed down North American, because we were doing things that North American hadn't even thought about putting in there, and they were absolutely essential for us. anyhow, this, with the schedule slipping and us still racing to beat the Russians to the moon, after about 6 months there, maybe 7, they canceled Apollo 2. So that was Wally, Don, and I. When they canceled Apollo 2, we moved in as the backup crew for Apollo 1. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee.
Yeah.
So we were still pushing to get Apollo 2 into the air, really all with the race against the Russians. And so for about 3 months, we were the backup crew on Apollo 1. And in fact, when the Apollo 1 crew they'd had that fire, they died in the fire, at 100% oxygen on the ground. The night before, our crew, the backup crew, we had performed the same checkout, except we had not done it with the hatch closed, so we weren't on 100% oxygen. So the next afternoon, we kept waiting around, actually to fly back together on that Friday. And Gus, Ed, and Roger spent quite a few hours. I can't remember if it was total 4 or 5 hours at 100% oxygen on the ground. That meant that the oxygen pressure inside that spacecraft was about 16.5 psi. And that is a lot, so it's really doing a lot with that oxygen. When you go into orbit and you're on 100% oxygen, you're at 5 psi. So it was a big difference. So when the crew was killed in that fire, must have been 2 weeks later or so, we got assigned to the first crew. So what I've been saying is really it was kind of a difficult way to get there. The public today doesn't even think about all that because we ended up flying that mission. And to this day, Apollo 1, the crew died in the fire. The new first crew was us. 21 months later, after doing, I think we did 1,040 changes, something like that, and we launched on what was called Apollo 7 then, but there's nothing tricky in there. It's just each one of the Apollo missions. This was the first manned one, and went 11 days with all those fixes, and today, that's 50 years later, Apollo 7 is still the longest, the most ambitious, the most successful first test flight of any new flying machine ever. But the public doesn't really know that.
Oh, no. I mean, what you did was really astounding, but it doesn't get the same fanfare, I suppose, as Apollo 11 or something like that.
Yeah.
So when you finally underwent the mission on Apollo 7, if you could put it into words, I know it's hard for anyone who hasn't experienced spaceflight to quite understand, but what went through your mind? What was the entire experience like of actually being out there?
Well, since we worked so hard with a couple of different opportunities that fell through, we were just glad to get there. And we breathed a sigh of relief when we lifted off. Excuse me. We were scheduled for 11 o'clock liftoff, and everything was going so perfect that it actually irritated us when we had to stop and get the pressure up in one of the tanks. Made us 2.5 minutes late at liftoff, which is today wouldn't be a big deal because a lot of them have delays. But I can remember us kind of irritated in there that, what do you mean we're going to be 2.5 minutes late? We could have been on time. But it was interesting. Don Isley and I had not been up before, so that was first time for us, but we adjusted very well. We never had any problems with being in zero gravity. We seemed to both of us felt perfectly comfortable. In fact, the second day we were up there, we did a few things to moving ourselves around to see for some reason why we were not getting sick, because in those days probably 25% of the guys had some of this zero gravity adjustment. Might take them 24 hours. Some of them it took longer. But we never had that. But we did have another problem, because just soon after we got there, Wally Schirra came down with a cold. So he's busy taking cold pills, and Wally made us take cold pills too, but we never had the cold. But, all in all, we got everything done. In spite of that, the situation of being the first flight was fairly unique, but we were able to get everything done. In fact, they added during that mission, things were going well enough. They added another 4 mission objectives, and I think 2 of those I don't think we got done. So, but we ended up classified as 101% successful.
Oh. So all the tests you underwent there, were they kind of routine and monotonous, or did you find them all interesting?
The tests that we went through, or that we subjected the equipment to?
That you subjected the equipment to.
Okay, well, basically it was for the operations and testing it in many cases at kind of the limits of it, to make sure that we had the ranges that we thought we needed on a lot of that equipment. And it was surprisingly good. And that was because, in my opinion, it was because the 21 months after the fire on the pad, we had devoted everything we could to get the equipment better, and the contractor and NASA were both, they were so wrapped up in trying to be a success that they were willing to let us make changes and improvements that before that fire we weren't able to get them to accept.
Sure. One thing I found interesting, supposedly they went out of their way to make the food more enjoyable for you, but none of your crew thought it was particularly good. Was that true? Or
none of our crew what?
Thought the food was particularly good.
Well, I can't say that we held it any worse than any other crew, but no. We were testing that food for about 3 months before we launched, and what we didn't really take into account, I can't remember why we weren't so aware of that, but they were doing experiments involving that food, and we had our each one of us had our separate kind of recipe that we had settled on from trying out what was available, and we had a recipe, or not a recipe, really a menu that for 3 days, and then on the 4th day we went back. You went back and started the same menu over again, and I guess it was probably by I bet it wasn't even more than 4 or 5 days later we started trading things around between us. Because some things some guys liked and some other guys did not like. And when we got back, we found out that that's one of the experiments that we had not done well, because they expected us to be changing the food around, changing the menus around on that. And we had one really very interesting emergency on that. About the 3rd or 4th day. I think I was the one that was on the chocolate pudding. This was our dessert. Those menus were set up with, I think, 2,100 or 2,200 calories a day for each of us if we ate everything, which we got to where we couldn't. But that chocolate pudding, that bag split, and we couldn't find anything. We didn't want that floating around. And Wally suggested we put it in our one of our urine bags that we had there. So we put it in there, put it away, never thought anything more about it. But when we got back on the ground and they were starting to do the results of the various menus that we had, and there was one thing missing. And that was that one chocolate pudding, and we didn't know what had happened to it. And then all of a sudden, one of us remembered and told them, said, "Oh, that's in one of those urine bags, one of those fecal bags." So the lady that was doing that test, it must be 4 or 5 days later, she came by the office, and she said that she had to open every one of those bags because it was the last bag that she got to that she found the pudding instead of the bowel movements.
Wow. So there was supposedly some tension between the flight crew and mission control during this mission, which may have led to the lack of future assignments for some of you. What did you make of this then, and now looking back on it?
Well, I just got to, somebody pointed out to me that there was some write-up on one of the, someplace on TV, not TV, on the internet here, on one of the bios that's got that in there. A part of it, you might say, is correct, but most of it, the way it's put there, there was a paragraph I read, was not. The ground in mission control, they did get irritated, but it wasn't because of just that. It was because of the attitude that Wally had. And, for example, Wally got a cold. And the very first day we were in orbit, he started taking cold pills. He was a Navy captain, and his dad had been an admiral, and his grandfather had been an admiral. And in Wally's mind, and he pushed this with the ground, that the commander of the ship, even if there's an outranked people that come on board, the commander of the ship is still the commander of the ship. So when he started doing some things there, they got into kind of a hassle with the ground. Because we were there with the same crew, I know I never participated in any of that because I didn't like what was going on. I was a Marine. You can always tell a Marine, but not much. But that did develop a negative attitude, principally against Wally, but it had its fallout too because of the ground control. They were desperate on everything being successful. But I went to Isley stayed in the program. Wally had told him he was going to be leaving a year and a half before, but because we finally got that first mission he inherited, he didn't leave until right after we got back. So he didn't really care about it. Isley was there on Apollo backup crew for months after that. I was put in charge of the Skylab branch of the astronaut office, and I was scheduled to fly the first Skylab mission if it had gone when they expected. But it didn't. It drifted on, and I ended up not being in that position. Pete Conrad ended up in that position and flying it.
Mm-hmm. So you did play an important management role in developing Skylab, though. What exactly was your task, and what were the most important lessons learned from Skylab?
Well, I'd say possibly my biggest contribution to NASA during my 8 years there was the 2 years that I was in charge of Skylab, and that was because until that happened in the past, the astronauts had not had a significant enough input on developing the Skylab, and the spacecraft was the same spacecraft we had before. Okay.
We can go beyond that, yeah.
Yeah, but when that came, when I was on that, we started fixing things, and it involved some fights with those people who had been working on Skylab for a couple of years, but had not included the crew input. So we really made the Skylab what it turned out to be. I think we created a hell of a lot of the changes that went on there for it. And I would have liked to have flown a Skylab mission, but after I moved from a primary to backup crew, I didn't want to wait around that period of time.
So you were part of the study panel in 1971 to decide on the next major program for NASA. Could we have really made it to Mars by 1984? And how different do you think these last decades would have been had this program been chosen?
Well, I don't recall that I was on the panel. I may have had an input into it back then, but I don't recall that I was actually on the panel. I was too busy working on Skylab. But they're talking about going to Mars in 1984. Even at the time, those of us that were astronauts knew that was an absolutely ridiculous time to talk about doing it. And even today, they've got ridiculous schedule on it. What's his name? Elon Musk. He's talking about going there in 2024. Absolutely nonsense. We can end up flying by maybe, but even that's going to be a lot of trouble. It's going to take us, if we commit to it today, and we're not committed yet, if we committed to it today, it would still be several decades, this is my opinion, before we'd end up doing that.
Yeah. No, I can't imagine they'd get there in a few years. And but I think it's a shame to have such a big gap between going to the moon and going to Mars. It feels like it should have been closer together.
Yeah, well, I'm not, my own thought is I'm not convinced even that there's a whole lot to be gained by going to Mars. I think we'll go there anyway because the best thing that will happen is we'll be pushing back the next frontier.
Right.
That's what happened when we went to the moon. We moved the frontier out away from the Earth and out into space. The technology that was developed to do that is still paying off for us years later, 50 years later. Mm-hmm. And there'll come a time when we'll take that challenge of going to Mars, and what's developed to do it will have a lot of impact in other areas as well. So that's what we'll do that in those days.
So if you were making the decisions today for how best to get the space program focused on what the firm goals and objectives should be moving forward, what would your agenda and priorities be?
Well, I could never have that authority, and there's a variety of different ideas that's out there. My personal opinion is that we don't be sitting here talking about going to Mars and landing on it and trying to come back with all that requires on it. There's a lot to be developed. I would be going to returning to the moon, developing a capability to have our crew people live on the moon for a period of time that will help us be practical for the time that we would have to stay on Mars if we went there. I would not be focusing much on Mars for some time, and the reason being is they've had unmanned exploration of Mars going on for some time now, and it's been amazingly good, if you ask me. Mm-hmm. They know so much more about Mars on the surface than we knew about the moon before we went to the moon. So I would be relying on the unmanned exploration of Mars for a while, some decades, and I'd be doing our work focusing on the ability to establish bases and things like that. I would be doing that on the moon.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So our last few questions here. I read something where you spoke very favorably of Wernher von Braun. I'm curious, what were your interactions with him like, and was there anyone more instrumental to the space program despite the controversy associated with him?
Well, I never could understand. I knew the history, where Wernher von came from and all that, but I could not understand a lot of controversy because he was a really fine manager. And I'll never forget that our first briefing, our crew, our selection of 14 of us, and we were up there at Huntsville, Alabama, and went to the conference room, and here was Wernher sitting at the end and had some of his other managers sitting around, and we sat down at that conference table. And I think that almost none of the questions or anything else that ever came up, and some of them pretty technical, none of them were answered by anybody but Wernher. Mm-hmm. And Wernher was a fine man also. I got to know him for some years. And we were fortunate to have Wernher von Braun.
So to pivot a little bit here, I also saw the climate change op-ed you wrote for the Houston Chronicle a number of years ago, mm-hmm. and I think it makes a pretty strong argument. Having said that, why do you think we're in a situation where we're told it's an undeniable consensus and anyone who questions it is condemned outright?
It's a question about, is it condemned to take a position like I have, or
anyone who questions the science behind claiming that there's massive man-made climate change, that carbon is causing it. Basically, if you say that, you're ostracized. Yeah.
I'm at a stage where I don't care what they try to do about that. I always stick with science. I've worked in and out of climate stuff. Well, I haven't really worked, but I've had an opinion about it for years. While we were still at NASA, Rusty and I and one other person down there, we formed an organization to looking at the atmosphere. Had nothing to do with this CO2 effect. And I've written a couple of articles in the past, but when it got to the point where our culture and our society has changed, the people at large do not routinely go look at the data themselves. And when I'm talking about this, there's only one thing that I really talk about. I really talk about, do you really think that humans are controlling our temperature? And that's the most obvious answer in the world, is that we are not controlling the temperature. So then I go through the discussion and we talk about, why. Do you know how much atmosphere that we humans, how much carbon dioxide that we put out?
What is it, like 0.0002, some small percentage? Well,
if you look at an atmosphere, it is 0.001% of the atmosphere is human controlled. Now, it's there's more CO2 than that, but we don't have anything to do about it. And when you look at that, to think that we're controlling the temperature of our planet it takes a total lack of intelligence to just accept that. But when I'm talking about it, the only thing I'm really talking about is telling people to go look at the data themselves. Quit believing the media, quit believing the politicians, quit believing these people who have never personally determined this. They've accepted what they've been told. And that's a weakness in our culture and our society that I don't know. Yeah, I would suspect eventually we'll probably get past that, but right now it's all every place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So finally, you've written a book about your experiences called The All-American Boys, as well as contributed to In the Shadow of the Moon. What can you tell us about those?
The All-American Boys?
Yes.
Well, my book, I wrote that 40 years ago, actually a little more than that, because it took me 4 years. It took me 3 years to write it. Sometimes I say I had a friend that helped me do some review for it until I got rid of my friend after about half the chapters. But I said I'd put his name on. So now they think of him as being, I guess, the author on my stuff. But it was not. I was the guy that did the book, and that was in the 70s. It took me 3 years. Macmillan then absorbed about another year before we got it out, and I helped them promote it for maybe a month, and then went on doing all my regular work. Never thought about it until about 10 years ago. Actually, 2002 or 3, I went through, updated that a little bit, and added 3 or 4 chapters talking about the relationship with the Russians, because to this day we still have a better operation for space than the Russians do, but we're totally dependent on the Russians. It costs us, $80 million for everybody we send up and back to the space station up there. But the book is it's loved growingly all the time. And there's other books out there. A couple of them that's pretty good too. Mike Collins' book, Carrying the Fire. A lot of people frequently will compare those two, and they don't go at things the same way. His book, I think, is quite interesting. Mine is considered a little more candid. I think he was a little smarter about not commenting about some of the personal relationships and things like that. But his book's excellent too. And I do push The All-American Boys when I get a chance, because it's still selling. I've done my own audio book on it. That took me 4 months to get that one done. So I recommend the All-American Boys to anybody.
No, that's great. So as a final question here, I'm curious, was there one person in the space agency that was really the most influential to you, someone who, despite, I know in your book you talk about the flaws of everyone involved, but was there one person who you kind of put up on a pedestal as someone you admired and looked to?
Well, who did I admire the most? Well, it required different capability at different aspects of the program, but some people really had it. Excuse me. I'm busy trying to think of his name right now that came in and took over Skylab when I'd been running for 2 years. Pete Conrad. He was one of the most capable people that you could imagine. Tom Stafford's still alive, and Tom was quite capable. Well, I'd be hard time to pick out any particular one because we had a number that were doing very good. Neil Armstrong was very, very capable guy, but he was not really active a lot socially or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But he knew how to get things done. I remember after he ejected on that little training landing machine he did before Apollo 11 flew, and I heard about it. My office was right next door to Neil's. I walked in his office right next door, and Neil was already there. It was an hour before that had happened. He's sitting there going through his work, writing, and what have you. No big deal to him at all. He's a very capable guy.
Wow. Well, I wanted to thank you again for coming on. It's been a real honor to speak to you, and it's been incredibly interesting hearing everything I had to say.
Well, thank you very much. I hope some people get something positive out of it, but glad to do it.
I hope so too. Thanks, and take care.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye. That was Colonel Walt Cunningham. It was wonderful having him on the show. So until next time, I'm signing off for now. This has been Ajay Bruno for the Ajay Bruno Show. We'll be back with another episode next week. It'll be hard to match this one, but we will be back then, and I'll see you then. Thanks again.